It's really hard to comprehend it because in 15 years it's hard to comprehend that happening.
For decades, the world has speculated about the man behind the king of rock and roll. Now, in an unprecedented experiment, researchers have fed hours of raw, unedited interview footage of Elvis Presley into a high-level AI emotion detector. The results are nothing short of chilling. By analyzing micro-expressions and vocal cadences invisible to the human eye, the AI uncovered a pattern of profound emotional suppression and internal conflict that remained hidden in plain sight. This data is forcing experts to rethink everything they thought they knew about the legend's final years. In this video, we reveal the specific moments where the AI detected startling anomalies, uncovering the hidden tragedy behind the iconic smile and changing our understanding of Elvis's life forever. I want to tell you in my own way. August of 1956, Elvis Presley sat down for an interview unlike most others he had given that year. Not a quick press scrum, not a handful of rushed questions backstage. This was something closer to a direct address. Presley speaking openly and at length, seemingly eager for the chance to explain himself fully. He opened with an introduction that, decades later, still stands out for its sheer warmth and directness. "Hi, this is Elvis Presley," he began. "Well, at last I'm getting the chance to sit down and talk to you, to speak right out and tell you all the things that are on my mind. I've wanted to tell you about myself for a long time, a real long time." This is not the language of someone managing his image carefully, parceling out information strategically. This is the language of someone who genuinely wanted to be understood, who saw the interview itself as an opportunity rather than an obligation. He continued in this same register throughout, explaining his choices, addressing his critics directly, inviting listeners into his actual thinking rather than offering them a polished, distant performance of celebrity. He addressed the criticism already swirling around his stage performances with unusual directness for someone only 21 years old and barely 2 years into national fame. A reporter had written that Presley's popularity depended entirely on his physical performance, his contortions, as the writer put it, rather than his actual musical talent. Presley pushed back on this characterization himself, somewhat playfully. "I wonder what this fellow would say if I told him that most of my records have been bought by people who have never seen me in person," he said, finding genuine humor in the critic's apparent blind spot. This combination, taking criticism seriously enough to engage with it directly while still finding the humor in it, defined much of his communication style during this earliest period of major fame. He was neither defensive nor dismissive. He simply seemed to enjoy the act of explaining himself, treating each question as a genuine opportunity for connection, rather than a hurdle to manage carefully. When asked about his personal life and simple pleasures, his answers carried the same unguarded warmth. "Sure, I like amusement parks. I like them a lot. And I like winning pandas and that kind of stuff. That's about the only relaxation I get when I'm on the road." He talked about missing his mother's cooking with obvious, uncomplicated affection. "My mouth waters every time I think of Mama's bacon and egg breakfast. I sure fill up on them when I'm home," he said, the kind of small, specific detail that reveals someone speaking naturally rather than performing a rehearsed answer. He also addressed, directly and without obvious defensiveness, the broader cultural backlash building around rock and roll itself during this period. "Everybody asks me, why do I sing like I do? I know as well as you what some people are saying. I'm not deaf. I can hear it same as you. They don't like dancing. They don't like Western music. They don't like rock and roll," he said, acknowledging the criticism plainly rather than dodging it. This same year, in a separate interview conducted in Little Rock, Arkansas, Presley offered a statement that revealed something significant about his own internal compass regarding his work, even this early in his career. "I'm never going to sing another song I don't believe in. I'm never going to make another picture I don't believe in," he said. A statement carrying genuine conviction rather than the careful hedging that often characterizes young performers navigating early fame and the competing pressures of management, studios, and public expectation. He also addressed, with disarming honesty, his own surprise at his physical performance style, the hip movements and stage presence that had already become both his signature and his most significant point of controversy. "The first time that I appeared on stage, it scared me to death. I really didn't know what all the yelling was about. I didn't realize that my body was moving. It's a natural thing to me," he explained, describing how he had asked his manager backstage what exactly he had done to provoke such a reaction, only to be told simply to do it again. This particular anecdote, repeated by Presley himself across multiple interviews during this early period, reveals someone genuinely still discovering his own effect on audiences, still processing his own sudden, overwhelming fame with something closer to bewilderment than calculated control. There is no defensive posture here, no careful management of narrative, just a young man trying, honestly and directly, to make sense of what was happening to him. Taken together, these 1956 interviews reveal a consistent pattern of openness, direct engagement with criticism rather than avoidance, and genuine warmth towards small, ordinary pleasures, amusement parks, his mother's cooking, simple gratitude rather than performed humility. A young man who, when given the chance to speak, used it fully, treating every question as worth a real, complete answer. This was Elvis Presley at 21. Only beginning the journey that fame and the following 2 decades would take him on. The voice captured in these earliest interviews would not disappear entirely in the years that followed, but it would change, gradually and then more dramatically, shaped by exactly the pressures he was only just beginning to encounter in 1956, learning to smooth the edges. By the late 1950s, the open, unguarded young man from those early interviews had already begun encountering forces that would gradually reshape how he spoke to the public. 2 specific developments during this period mattered enormously to that shift: his military service and his expanding career in Hollywood films. Presley was drafted into the United States Army in March of 1958, a development that placed him, almost overnight, into one of the most rigidly structured institutional environments imaginable. The same young man who had spoken so freely and personally in his 1956 interviews now found himself operating within a system that valued discipline, uniformity, and careful, measured public conduct above nearly everything else. His interviews during his military service reflect this shift clearly. Where his earlier answers had wandered comfortably into personal territory, his commentary at this point grew noticeably more careful, more aware of representing not just himself but an institution with its own expectations regarding how soldiers, particularly famous ones, should present themselves publicly. This was not necessarily a dramatic, sudden transformation. It was a gradual recalibration, the natural result of 2 years spent inside a structure that rewarded restraint considerably more than the open enthusiasm that had defined his earliest public statements. Following his discharge in March of 1960, Presley returned to civilian life and, increasingly, to a film career that would dominate much of the following decade. This transition introduced an entirely different kind of pressure toward careful, managed public communication. Hollywood studio publicity machines of this era operated with considerable sophistication, carefully shaping how their stars appeared in interviews, controlling access, and generally steering public figures toward answers that protected commercial interests and maintained a consistent, marketable public image. Interviews from this period, stretching through much of the 1960s, show Presley adopting a noticeably more polished, performance-oriented communication style. His answers remained generally pleasant and cooperative, but they carried less of the spontaneous, personal texture that had characterized his 1956 interviews. He had, by this point, given hundreds of interviews connected to dozens of films, and the repetition itself likely contributed to this shift. The same questions about his career, his music, and his personal life answered so many times that genuinely fresh, spontaneous responses became increasingly difficult to sustain authentically. A quote from this general period, reflecting on his early career with the benefit of several years' distance, reveals someone considerably more measured than the eager 21-year-old from 1956, while still retaining genuine reflective depth. "I don't regard money or position as important, but I can never forget the longing to be someone. I guess if you are poor, you always think bigger and want more than those who have everything when they are born," he told Time magazine in May of 1965. This statement carries real emotional honesty, but it arrives wrapped in a more considered, almost philosophical framing compared to the immediate, conversational warmth of his 1956 answers. A separate interview from 1968 reveals something even more significant emerging beneath the polished surface, a hint of melancholy that had not been nearly as visible in his earliest public statements. The trouble is, when a fellow is by himself and starts thinking, the sad things are always stronger in his memory than the happy things, he told Tropic magazine that year. This single statement marks a meaningful shift from the largely upbeat, forward-looking energy of his 1956 interviews towards something more introspective and, at moments, genuinely somber. This shift coincided with genuine personal and professional difficulty during the mid to late 1960s. His film career, while commercially successful for years, had increasingly drawn critical scorn for its formulaic plots and diminishing artistic ambition. His marriage to Priscilla, finalized in 1967, brought new personal stability in some respects, while also introducing new pressures and complications. The open, eager young performer from 1956 had, by the late 1960s, become someone considerably more aware of fame's costs, someone whose public statements increasingly carried traces of genuine fatigue and reflection, alongside the continued professional politeness that had become second nature after over a decade of constant public exposure. This gradual evolution, from spontaneous warmth toward careful, sometimes weary reflection, did not happen suddenly or dramatically. It accumulated slowly, shaped by years of military discipline, studio publicity management, professional repetition, and the simple, cumulative weight of over a decade spent constantly observed and constantly required to perform some version of public composure, regardless of his actual internal state. By the end of the 1960s, Presley stood at a significant professional crossroads. His film career had grown stale, both critically and, increasingly, commercially. A return to live performance in television, the eventual 1968 comeback special, and the subsequent return to touring would soon introduce yet another shift in how he spoke publicly, one that would briefly recapture some of the energy and directness of his earliest interviews, even as deeper currents of guardedness, established gradually across the preceding decade, remained present beneath the surface. This combination, flashes of renewed enthusiasm, layered over increasingly practiced caution, would define his public voice through the early 1970s, visible clearly in the press conferences that accompanied his triumphant return to large-scale live performance. The comeback, and what came back with it. By 1969, Elvis Presley had re-emerged as a live performer after years focused almost entirely on increasingly formulaic film work. His 1968 television special had reminded the world, and seemingly reminded him as well, of exactly what he could do in front of a live audience without the constraints of a movie soundstage. The press conferences accompanying this comeback period offer a genuinely fascinating midpoint in the broader evolution of his public voice. On July the 31st, 1969, Presley sat for an interview with British journalist Ray Connolly, part of the press attention surrounding his return to Las Vegas performance. Accounts of this conversation, along with the formal press conference held the following day on August the 1st, reveal something genuinely interesting when compared against both his 1956 warmth and the more guarded patterns that had developed through the 1960s. Flashes of the old energy clearly returned during this period. Presley appeared genuinely excited about performing live again, energized by the immediate, direct connection with an audience that years of film work had largely denied him. His answers during these 1969 press appearances carried more spontaneity and enthusiasm than his typical interviews from the preceding decade, a kind of rekindled engagement that mirrored the genuine professional renewal he was experiencing. Yet something had also clearly changed beneath this renewed energy, something that distinguishes these 1969 appearances from his 1956 interviews, despite their shared enthusiasm. Where his earliest interviews had revealed someone still discovering and processing his own fame in real time, his 1969 appearances reveal someone who had spent over a decade learning exactly how fame worked, someone whose enthusiasm now operated alongside a much more developed, practiced awareness of his own public image and how to manage it. This distinction matters considerably to understanding the broader pattern across his full public life. The energy had genuinely returned. The complete openness of 1956 had not returned alongside it. He had learned too much in the intervening 13 years, encountered too many forms of scrutiny and pressure, to simply revert to the unguarded directness of his earliest public statements, regardless of how genuinely excited he felt about returning to live performance. The Houston Astrodome press conference in February of 1970 offers another useful data point from this same general period. Presley continued demonstrating genuine wit and engagement during these public appearances, clearly comfortable handling reporters' questions with confidence built across nearly 15 years of public life. but this confidence increasingly took the specific form of skilled deflection, rather than genuine, extended personal disclosure. He had become, by this point, remarkably good at appearing open and engaged, while actually revealing relatively little of his genuine internal state, a skill that stands in direct contrast to the unfiltered directness of his 1956 interview. This particular kind of practiced charm, warm, funny, immediately engaging, yet ultimately protective of anything genuinely vulnerable, would become increasingly central to his public communication style throughout the remainder of his career. It represents neither the complete openness of his earliest years, nor the more visibly weary, withdrawn quality that would eventually characterize his final years. It occupies a specific middle territory, the practiced performer who has learned to give audiences and reporters exactly enough genuine-seeming warmth and humor to satisfy them, without actually opening the deeper, more vulnerable layers his 1956 self had once offered so readily. A useful illustration of this pattern comes from his own later reflection on his stage performance style, offered during this general comeback period. Asked about the dramatic physical performance that had once scandalized critics and parents alike, he offered an answer that was simultaneously funny, self-deprecating, and carefully non-committal regarding anything genuinely personal. "Man, I was tame compared to what they do now," he would later say of his own controversial stage moves, a joke that deflected attention through humor rather than genuine reflection. Very different from his 1956 willingness to engage directly and earnestly with the same kind of criticism. This pattern, using humor and charm as a sophisticated form of deflection rather than as an invitation toward genuine connection, distinguishes his comeback-era public voice from both his earliest interviews and his eventual, more visibly guarded final years. It represents a kind of peak performance skill, genuinely impressive in its execution, while also revealing just how far his public communication style had evolved from the unguarded young man who had once said, simply and directly, that he wanted to tell people exactly what was on his mind. Reporters covering this period generally came away impressed by his charisma and apparent ease, rarely commenting on any sense of guardedness or withholding, a testament to just how skillfully he had developed this particular communication style by the early 1970s. The shift was not obvious or dramatic to outside observers encountering him in any single interview. It only becomes clearly visible when his 1969 and 1970 press appearances are placed directly alongside his 1956 interviews. The genuine, unguarded warmth of his earliest public statements compared against the polished, carefully charming deflection that had, by this point, become his default public mode. This pattern would continue evolving through the early 1970s, reaching perhaps its most clearly documented expression during his 1972 Madison Square Garden press conference, where a single, direct question about his own public image would draw out an answer, revealing, with unusual clarity, exactly how thoroughly he had come to understand the gap between the person reporters were questioning and the carefully constructed figure they actually believed they were speaking with. The image is one thing. June the 9th, 1972. The New York Hilton. Elvis Presley sat before reporters ahead of his historic run at Madison Square Garden, the first time he would perform live in New York City since his television appearances in the mid-1950s. By every external measure, this was a triumphant moment. He had just become the first entertainer in history to sell out 4 consecutive shows at Madison Square Garden, 20,000 fans filling the arena for each performance, a total of 80,000 tickets sold across the weekend. David Bowie, Bob Dylan, George Harrison, and Art Garfunkel were among those spotted in attendance, a roster of fellow musical legends acknowledging the magnitude of the moment. The press conference itself captured Presley at 37 years old, still capable of genuine wit, still comfortable commanding a room full of reporters. When asked about the criticism he had once faced for his hip movements and long hair, he responded with characteristic humor. "Man, I was tame compared to what they do now. Are you kidding? I didn't do anything but just jiggle," he said, drawing the kind of easy laughter that had become his trademark in these public settings. Asked why he believed he had outlasted virtually every other major entertainer from both the 1950s and 1960s, he offered an answer built entirely on deflecting humor rather than genuine reflection. "I take vitamin E," he said, then immediately undercut the joke. "I was only kidding. I don't know. This specific exchange captures something significant about his communication style at this particular moment in his career. A genuinely interesting, substantive question about his own remarkable cultural longevity, met first with a joke, then with a shrug, then with nothing further. No genuine attempt at reflection or explanation, despite 17 years of evidence and experience that might have supported a considerably more thoughtful answer had he chosen to offer one. Then came the question that, more than any other moment in his 1972 press conference, reveals exactly how far his public voice had traveled from his 1956 interviews. A reporter asked him directly whether he was satisfied with the image he had established. "Well, the image is one thing, a human being is another," Presley replied. The reporter pressed further, asking how closely that public image actually matched the man underneath it. "It's very hard to live up to an image," Presley said. "I'll put it that way." This exchange deserves careful attention, specifically because of what it reveals and, just as significantly, what it withholds. Presley directly acknowledged, in front of the assembled press, that a meaningful gap existed between his public image and his actual internal experience as a human being. This represents a moment of genuine, if brief, candor, an explicit admission that fame had created some kind of separation between perception and reality in his own life. Yet the specific phrasing he chose, "It's very hard to live up to an image, I'll put it that way," reveals someone offering just enough acknowledgement to seem genuinely reflective, while carefully avoiding any further elaboration about what that gap actually contained, what specifically made it difficult, or how he personally experienced that distance between image and self. He named the existence of the problem without describing its substance. Compare this directly against his 1956 interview, where he had said, without any prompting or careful hedging, that he wanted to tell listeners exactly what was on his mind, that he hoped people would understand him if given the chance to speak personally. The 1972 version of Presley acknowledged that something significant existed beneath his public image, then declined, smoothly and almost imperceptibly, to actually open that territory for examination. This pattern, naming a genuine truth while simultaneously declining to elaborate on it, represents perhaps the clearest, most concentrated example available of exactly how his public communication style had evolved across 16 years of increasing fame and scrutiny. He had not become dishonest. The image is one thing, a human being is another remains a genuinely true, even insightful statement about the particular burden of extreme fame. He had instead become skilled, in a way his 1956 self simply was not yet, at offering precisely enough apparent vulnerability to satisfy a question without actually providing the deeper content that vulnerability would seem to promise. Reporters present at this 1972 press conference generally came away impressed by his candor and self-awareness, taking his comments about image and reality as a genuinely thoughtful, mature reflection on fame's particular burdens. In one sense, this reaction was entirely justified. The statement itself carries real insight. But placed alongside his 1956 interview, where he had spoken at considerable length and with genuine specificity about his actual thoughts, feelings, and motivations, the 1972 exchange reveals something the contemporary reporters in that room could not have fully recognized without that earlier interview directly in front of them for comparison. The young man who had once wanted nothing more than the chance to explain himself fully had become, by 1972, someone who could acknowledge the existence of a hidden self with elegant, quotable precision, while keeping that hidden self almost entirely out of view. This was not necessarily calculated deception. It likely reflected, at least in part, genuine fatigue, genuine difficulty articulating something as complex as the psychological weight of 17 years of extreme fame, and genuine, practiced habit built from years of learning exactly how much to reveal in these carefully managed public settings. Within roughly 5 years of this 1972 press conference, that same careful, practiced guardedness would deepen even further, as his final years brought considerably more difficulty, considerably more isolation, and public appearances that revealed even less of the open, eager young man who had once introduced himself so warmly in 1956. When the jokes got shorter, By his final years, Elvis Presley's public appearances had grown noticeably sparser than during his 1969 comeback period or his triumphant 1972 Madison Square Garden run. Health difficulties, increasingly irregular touring schedules, and growing personal isolation all contributed to fewer extended press opportunities, and the ones that did occur reveal a public voice considerably more compressed than even his 1972 answers. His 1973 Aloha from Hawaii satellite broadcast press coverage offers one useful data point from this later period. Interview material connected to this broadcast shows Presley capable, still, of charm and professionalism, but with noticeably less of the extended, playful back and forth that had characterized his 1969 and 1972 press appearances. Answers grew shorter, elaboration grew rarer. The pattern established gradually across the preceding 17 years, openness giving way to polish, polish giving way to skilled deflection, had by this point compressed even further into something closer to efficient, minimal public engagement. This compression makes sense within the broader context of his declining health and increasingly difficult personal circumstances during this final stretch of his career. Maintaining the kind of extended, charming deflection he had perfected by 1972 requires real energy and sustained engagement, resources that became increasingly scarce as his physical and emotional health deteriorated across his final years. The wit remained present in flashes. The willingness to sustain it across longer exchanges diminished considerably. A statement attributed to this general later period, reflecting on his approach to performance, retains some of his characteristic humor while carrying a flatter, more matter-of-fact quality compared to his earlier, more animated reflections. My daddy knew a lot of guitar players, and most of them didn't work, so he said, "You should make your mind up to either be a guitar player or an electrician. But I never saw a guitar player that was worth a damn," he said, recounting a familiar family anecdote with the kind of practiced ease that suggested a story told many times before, polished smooth through repetition rather than offered freshly in the moment. This particular quality, anecdotes worn smooth through repetition, distinguishes his final year's public communication from every earlier period examined here. His 1956 interviews carried the texture of someone discovering and articulating his own experience in real time. His final years carried, increasingly, the texture of someone reciting a small, carefully maintained set of stories and deflections, sufficient to satisfy interview obligations without requiring genuine, fresh engagement with difficult or revealing material. This is not to suggest his final public appearances were dishonest or cynical. They likely reflected, more than anything else, genuine exhaustion. A man simply too depleted, physically and emotionally, to sustain the kind of energetic, extended charm that had defined his 1969 and 1972 press conferences. The deflection that had once required active, skillful management had, by this point, become simply the default, low-effort mode available to someone with considerably less reserve left to draw upon. A particularly revealing later statement, reprinted after his death in a 1977 collection titled Elvis in His Own Words, offers a glimpse of genuine reflection that briefly cuts through this later pattern of compressed, practiced answers. "Since I was 2 years old, all I knew was gospel music. That music became such a part of my life, it was as natural as dancing, a way to escape from the problems. And my way of release," he said. A statement that carries unmistakable emotional weight and genuine specificity, closer in spirit to his 1956 openness than to the deflecting humor of his 1972 press conference. This kind of occasional, genuine break in the broader pattern matters significantly to understanding his final years accurately. The shift from open eagerness toward guarded deflection was never absolute or complete. Flashes of genuine, unguarded reflection continued surfacing throughout his final years, particularly, it seems, when discussing subjects that mattered to him most directly and personally: his music, his faith, his family, rather than the more generic questions about fame and image that had increasingly drawn his most practiced, least revealing responses. This pattern, genuine openness surfacing specifically around his deepest personal commitments, while broader, more generic questions increasingly drew compressed, practiced deflection, offers a more nuanced picture than a simple, linear decline from openness toward guardedness. He had not lost the capacity for genuine reflection entirely. He had instead learned, across over 2 decades of public life, exactly where to deploy that genuine reflection selectively, reserving it for the subjects that mattered most to him personally, while protecting the rest of his internal experience behind increasingly practiced, efficient public charm. By the time of his final public appearances in 1977, this pattern had fully solidified. Brief, warm engagement with audiences during performances themselves, where his genuine connection to music and performance remained visibly intact even as his physical health visibly declined. Considerably more guarded, compressed engagement with press and interviews, where decades of practiced deflection had become simply the default, requiring little active effort to maintain. Placed alongside his 1956 interview, eager and expansive, his answer to that final period's reporters reveals the full arc of an evolution that had unfolded gradually across more than 2 decades of unprecedented, sustained global fame. The young man who had once said he wanted nothing more than the chance to tell people everything on his mind had become, by his final years, someone who generally preferred not to, reserving his most genuine expression almost entirely for the music itself, the one form of communication that had never required him to manage, deflect, or carefully calibrate exactly how much of himself the world was allowed to see, a pattern hiding in plain sight. Placed end to end, the interviews examined here, 1956 through his final years, do not reveal a hidden secret or a previously unknown truth about Elvis Presley. Every quote referenced throughout this examination has existed in the public record for decades, available to anyone willing to seek it out across biographies, archived press conferences, and published interview collections. What changes when these interviews are placed directly alongside one another, in careful chronological sequence rather than scattered across decades of separate retellings, is not the underlying facts themselves, but the visibility of the pattern those facts actually form together. The 21-year-old who introduced himself so warmly in 1956, eager to explain himself fully, treating every question as a genuine invitation toward connection, existed within the same man who would later say, with practiced precision, that the image is one thing and a human being is another, before declining to elaborate further. The same voice that once described missing his mother's bacon and egg breakfast with uncomplicated, specific affection would later compress entire life philosophies into worn, familiar anecdotes recited efficiently rather than discovered freshly in the moment. This evolution did not happen suddenly or dramatically at any single identifiable turning point. It accumulated gradually, shaped by 2 years of military discipline that rewarded restraint over spontaneity, by over a decade of Hollywood publicity management that smoothed his answers into something more consistently marketable, by the sheer repetition of giving hundreds of interviews addressing largely the same questions about fame, music, and image. Each individual shift, examined in isolation, would likely seem unremarkable, simply one more interview among hundreds, one more reporter asking one more familiar question. It is specifically the accumulation, viewed across the full arc of his public life rather than through any single appearance, that makes the broader pattern genuinely visible. A young man who once wanted nothing more than the chance to speak personally and at length, gradually learning, across 2 decades of sustained, unprecedented global fame, exactly how much of himself the public situation actually required him to reveal, and exactly how to offer audiences and reporters enough warmth and wit to satisfy them without exposing the deeper, more vulnerable layers his earliest interviews had once offered so readily and without apparent calculation. This pattern, openness gradually giving way to polish, polish gradually giving way to skilled, charming deflection, eventually compressing into efficient, practiced minimalism, reflects something considerably larger than simply one famous man's personal evolution. It illustrates a broader, recognizable dynamic connected to sustained fame generally, the way prolonged public exposure tends to teach even naturally open, generous communicators exactly how to protect themselves, gradually and almost imperceptibly, behind increasingly practiced public personas. What makes Presley's specific case particularly valuable for examining this pattern clearly is the sheer volume and consistency of documented interview material spanning his entire adult public life, from his earliest, most unguarded statements in 1956 through his final, more compressed public appearances roughly 2 decades later. Few public figures offer such a complete, continuously documented record across such a dramatic arc of fame, allowing this particular evolution to become visible with unusual clarity when the full sequence is finally examined together rather than encountered piecemeal across scattered, separate retellings. This visibility matters beyond simple historical curiosity. It offers a genuinely useful lens for understanding Presley's broader life and eventual decline, connecting directly to the well-documented isolation, paranoia, and guardedness that defined his final years in ways extending well beyond his public interviews specifically. The same man who learned, gradually, to protect his internal experience from public scrutiny through skilled, charming deflection in press conferences appears to have applied similar protective instincts, less successfully and with considerably more damaging consequences, to his closest personal relationships during his final, most difficult years. Researchers and biographers studying Presley's full life and eventual death have long recognized pieces of this broader pattern individually: his growing isolation, his complicated relationship with fame's pressures, his eventual reliance on medication, partly to manage both physical pain and psychological strain. What examining his full interview record chronologically adds is a clear, documented illustration of exactly how gradually and consistently this broader pattern of protective withdrawal developed, visible not just in his private relationships and eventual health decline, but in the literal, recorded words he offered publicly across more than 2 decades of sustained global fame. The young man from 1956 never fully disappeared. Flashes of that same genuine openness surfaced periodically throughout his later years, particularly when discussing the subjects that mattered to him most directly: his music, his faith, his family. But the broader trajectory, traced carefully across his complete public record, reveals someone who learned, gradually and almost certainly without full conscious awareness of the process itself, exactly how to become harder to fully see, even while remaining one of the most watched, most photographed, most extensively interviewed public figures of the entire 20th century. The pattern was never hidden. It was simply scattered across 2 decades of separate interviews, waiting for someone to place them side by side. Elvis Presley's own words, examined in full sequence, tell a quieter story than any conspiracy ever could. If this examination gave you a fuller picture of the man behind the legend, subscribe for more deep dives into the voice's history left fully on the record.